Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Educational Technology Special Interest Group, I would like to welcome you to this webinar on the topic of digital leadership and cultural change in schools, challenges and opportunities. My name is Lydia Limperis, and I am an education policy researcher at Round Europe. This introduction on the screen is probably a bit out of date. I have now completed my PhD and I co-convened the Educational Technology Special Interest Group alongside Jacqueline Baxter, who's also one of our speakers today. Now, why are we talking about digital leadership and cultural change? Well, COVID-19 and subsequent efforts to teach digitally have revealed the vast socioeconomic gaps that blight societies and education systems. During the pandemic, countries with the lowest educational performance not only fully closed their schools for longer, but the attainment gap between pupils in areas of high socioeconomic deprivation increased. Yet, there have also been some positive developments with many schools and their staff attaining new levels of digital innovation. In fact, research findings indicate that many schools have developed a digital vision, which emanates from the learning they acquired during the pandemic. However, for some schools, this has not moved them forward in terms of their digital strategy. So we felt that this was an important topic and that it would be interesting to facilitate a discussion around differing perspectives on digital planning to examine the challenges and opportunities for schools in this regard and discuss the effects of digital learning on students, on staff, on leaders, and on parents. And therefore, we've brought together five educational researchers with extensive experience exploring these topics in order for them to share their experiences and their perspectives on this, and not only address your questions, but also pose new questions. So let me start now by introducing our speakers for today.
Over to the chair.
Ooh. Thank you. In order of presentation, first of all, we have Dr. Jacqueline Baxter, Associate Professor in Public Policy and Management and Director for the Center of Innovation in Online Business and Legal Education at the Faculty of Business and Law at the Open University. Jacqueline is Principal Fellow of the Higher Education Academy, Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences, and elected council member of the British Educational Leadership, Management and Administration Society. In addition, she's editor-in-chief of the SAGE journal Management in Education. Jacqueline's current funded research projects examine the interrelationship between trust, accountability, and capacity in improving learning outcomes and the strategic management of online learning in secondary schools during and beyond COVID-19. Jacqueline is based in the Department of Public Leadership and Social Enterprise at the Open University Business School. Thank you, Jacqueline, for joining us. Dr. Richard Holm is a lecturer in education at the School of Education and Social Work at the University of Dundee. He's academic lead for the MED, Master in Education programs, and teaches on undergraduate and postgraduate programs. His areas of specialism include primary education, STEM subjects, and curriculum innovation. Richard's main area of research interest is teacher professional learning and development, specifically focusing on grassroots professional development. He completed his doctoral research thesis on the topic of DIY, or teacher-initiated professional development. Thank you, Richard, for joining us today. With us also today is Professor Alan Floyd, Professor of Education at the University of Reading Institute of Education, and also a Senior Fellow of the Higher Education Academy. Alan's research and teaching activity focuses on two substantive areas: educational leadership and doctoral education, with a specific interest in areas such as academic leadership, school leadership and multi-academy trusts, how people perceive and experience being a leadership in a leadership role, distributed and collaborative leadership, leadership development, career trajectories, identity, insider research and associated ethical issues, and also the support of doctoral researchers. Thank you for joining us, Alan. Next, we have Dr. Serdar Adaji, lecturer in data and digital literacies at the Murray House School of Education and Sport at the University of Edinburgh. He has previously held postdoctoral position at Indiana University and Newcastle University, and has studied the evaluation of educational technologies, particularly the adoption of e-textbooks by instructors and students. Serdar holds a PhD in instructional systems technology and a master's degree in educational inquiry, both from Indiana University. His research interests include data and digital literacies, feedback, online learning, and evaluation of teaching and learning technologies. Most recently, Serdar is leading a comprehensive review of how educational technology implementations are evaluated in human-computer interaction-oriented publications. Thank you for joining us, Serdar. And Serdar is also joined in his presentation by Elizabeth Craig. Elizabeth has taught in the Borders for 8 years and has been involved in the Inspire program for one. The focus of the program this year has been encouraging and highlighting the use of digital technology to enhance teaching and learning through training and supporting practitioners in the program's cluster schools. Welcome, Elizabeth. I'm not sure if Elizabeth will be able to join us live today, but in either case, we will have her contribution with us today. Before we begin, I would like to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded and will be made available to BERA members as a digital resource on the BERA website. If you've got questions, which we very much welcome, of course, it's better to share these via Slido rather than the chat, where we might miss things. So we're using Slido as our main channel of communication for this webinar. We have a dedicated Q&A slot after each presentation, but our speakers will also be able to address questions during the plenary session towards the end of the webinar, which will involve a panel discussion with all our speakers and hopefully contributions from our delegates too. Excuse me, I would like to invite you now to introduce yourself via the Q&A tab on Slido by letting us know who you are and what your role is, so we get a sense of the composition of the group with us today. And yes, I think all that's left for me to say is welcome to everyone, and we look forward to your contributions and insights throughout the next 3 hours. I will now hand over to Jacqueline. Welcome again, Jacqueline, and over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Lydia. So this morning, as Lydia said, we're going to be talking about various aspects of any cultural change that's been brought about through COVID in schools. And I'm going to talk about a funded project that I'm carrying out with Professor Alan Floyd, who will be speaking to you later, which is focusing on the strategic planning for digital education in English secondary schools before, during, and also in the post-COVID period, which we're considering to be from the end of restrictions. There's a lot of literature about ICT in schools, as you will all be aware. There's not a huge amount out there about how the leadership of ICT influences the adoption and the cultural change needed to really embed ICT as a whole school approach. So just to kick off, obviously there are quite a few reports, one particularly by the OECD, that show that over 1.2 billion children over the period of COVID in 2019 to 2021 have been out of the classroom, physically out of the classroom. In England, the adoption of ICT in schools really didn't gain traction until the early 90s under the Labour government then. And although there have been many innovations, I myself worked on one called the New Opportunities Fund for teaching and learning and ICT in schools in 2000. The embedding of technology in schools hasn't taken off in the way that it was anticipated. There's lots of good practice out there. There's lots of fantastic teacher innovation, and I'm sure my colleagues will be talking about that over the course of the seminar. But it hasn't been embedded to the extent that the early policy makers thought it would be. So this funded research, it was funded by the UKRI as part of the COVID emergency funding. And we are interested to see where schools are, where they were during their digital planning, in terms of their digital planning before COVID struck, what happened during COVID, and then specifically what has happened since the end of restrictions. And we know, I'm not going to say the end of the pandemic, because we know that the pandemic isn't over. There are still a lot of people dying of COVID. So it's the end of restrictions that we're looking at and we're classifying as the post period. So as I said, the first national assessment of the impact of ICT was conducted with the Impact Report in 1993. And that was the first real effort by the UK government to highlight a need for in-service training in ICT, as well as other issues in the adoption of ICT in schools, which were reiterated by the Stevenson Report in 97. There's always been a little bit of a, in terms of culture, there's always been a lot of debate about the impact of ICT on learning outcomes. And I think the literature reflects that it's impossible to take a whole school across every single subject look and say, yes, the use of ICT does improve learning outcomes, that the leadership and the beliefs and the leadership of ICT in schools is instrumental in pushing for a whole school approach. Don't seem to be getting a move on of my slide, Dior. Could you move it on for me, please? Thank you. So Eichmann in 2011 very usefully identified 8 commonalities of schools that have succeeded in sustainable digital integration. And that really is a very useful starting point for us. So their leaders possess strong leadership skills and a sound understanding of the potential of ICT to enhance learning. They've established cooperation with external partners in relation to raising funding, and they realise intra-school cooperation, which is integrated into school concepts and culture. And I think that's a very important point to highlight, particularly in the marketised environment of England, that this intra-school and inter-school cooperation is really key. They've developed new concepts to cope with new digital trends. They use their radius of operation on the process to deal with problems and challenges. So they nip challenges in the bud and they act proactively. They don't externalize the problems or blame it on ICT. They look for solutions. They disseminate the idea of digital learning to improve learning outcomes throughout the school. And this is very, very key, because this is the way that the inspectorate also inspects digital learning in schools. They look at the way that it's been embedded within the curriculum and evaluated in that way. And they link the digital learning to existing and prospective pedagogical aims. and design an infrastructure with these in mind. And by infrastructure, I mean the physical buildings of the school, as well as the online interactions. So as I say, we're evaluating the strategy before, during and after the pandemic. This was a survey that was done by the DFE, just looking at the amount of schools in the school phase that have or had digital plans, whole school plans. And as you can see there, in secondary school, the results are quite interesting. So 40% of academies had school-specific plans, and 77% of local authority maintained had school-specific digital strategic plans. And then we go to academy trusts, and we see there that 59% have got trust-wide plans. Whether, of course, you know, the multi-academy trusts are either local authority aren't really being pushed until this present government paper is implemented in whatever form. So we used a four-stage level stages of digital implementation. So level one, and this is very much digital strategy. So though it looks a bit like Punta Dura, it's not Punta Dura, because Punta Dura is very much focusing on obviously the implementation at the teacher level, but this is looking at the strategic planning, specifically the strategic planning. So at level one, we have teachers using technology for their subject teaching, but little resource planning and no whole school approach, and not really very much planning in relation to department level. And then we've got level two, where teachers will be engaging in digital learning, and they are starting or have started their own communities of practice and development. There may be some resource planning in order to develop their skills and knowledge, but it'll be localized, it'll be confined to possibly to individual subject specializations, and might not even have got to department level. Level three is a department level, so there'll be some digital strategy in relation to particular departments in the school, but not across the entire school. And then finally, level four looks at digital strategy being implemented across the whole school with a 3 or 5 year plan for its development and implementation, and adequate resources, material, financial and human, dedicated to the strategic planning. So our sample, we worked with three project partners. We are working, the project finishes in October. We work with Schools North East, a very large grouping of schools in the northeast of England. We work with Derbyshire Teaching Schools Alliance, and then we are also working with the key leaders, who are a pay-for service who offer excuse me, support to school leaders and school governors across the UK. We chose in our sample 40% of schools in areas of high socioeconomic deprivation. And the reason for that was because we know that quite often, according to research, there is less development in schools of this nature. And we also wanted to see how those particular schools had come on within their planning, within their digital strategic planning, comparing before the pandemic to the post-restriction era. It builds on our previous work that we've done in taking strategy as a narrative approach, and that is a strategy as practice learning approach, where the micro processes of strategy are as important as the particular strategic plan itself. And the strategy as practice approach, strategy as learning approach, was largely coined by researchers in the late 1990s who wanted to move away from the idea that creating strategy was a matter of creating a strategic plan and then reviewing it once a year. They see strategy as practice, and we see strategy as practice as something that is continually evolving within the school, that is addressed at virtually every meeting, or elements of it are, that is responsive to changes within the environment. So that's the strategy as practice, strategy as narrative approach, and you can read about that in those papers, and there is a list of references at the end as well. So our sample included a number of schools. We interviewed head teachers and CEOs of multi-academy trusts at 50 schools. We have also done a grey literature analysis of 200 schools, looking at their websites, their strategic plans, etc., etc. We developed a coding framework which included the vision for online teaching. So how did the vision change before and after COVID? What were the key challenges that school leaders were facing before COVID, during COVID, but also importantly in this period now? What is stopping them from implementing this whole school approach? We coded using the levels of strategic planning that I mentioned earlier, and we coded for evidence of strategy as a learning activity as well, and particularly the metacognitive aspects of strategy as learning, because some previous work funded by Leverhulme revealed that metacognitive, in other words, leaders understanding that they're learning about strategy and that they're adopting this result, was a very important element of the strategy as learning, strategy as practice approach. So the realization and the acknowledgement that this is a learning process, and whilst it might be scary, I'm learning and I'm developing and I'm responding to the environment and to the changing policy environment, the changing socioeconomic environment all the time. And I think, as we've seen, I saw a tweet by Toby Greene this morning with a particularly horrific statistic of how many head teachers have resigned since the pandemic. And I think, you know, that responsiveness has obviously taken its toll because obviously they've been fighting on all levels. And the changes in approach to strategic planning for online learning between lockdowns. So you can see by this diagram here that we've got schools in the North, Midlands, South, and then the total. And you can see that the majority of, or the largest category of schools, moved from level 1, which was individual teachers using ICT, to level 3, which was a departmental approach. That was the biggest leap for many schools. The second biggest leap was from category 1 to 2. So teachers, from individual teachers using ICT to teachers getting together and creating communities of practice. And this came through particularly strongly in the research, and has come through, I know, in other papers that relate to the similar aspects during the pandemic that have just recently been published. Interestingly enough, there were quite a few schools that, as you can see from the diagram, that made an enormous leap from individual teachers using ICT to a very much a whole school approach. And in fact, one of those figures included in there was a multi-academy trust with a number of schools who had decided to put the entire curriculum online for the future. Not that they intended to teach that wholesale online, but they intended to have the whole curriculum online so that it could be used as and when it was deemed necessary to embed those particular aspects in the curriculum. 8 out of 50 schools moved from levels 1 to level 4. I had that very impressive jump, but only one of those was in an area of high socioeconomic deprivation. And I'll take some quotes from one of those schools here to illustrate why this, you know, this substantial shift occurred and what might be holding it up. So before, the head teacher said we were exploring the use of ICT, but hadn't got as far as developing a strategy. So homework worksheets used when youngsters were ill, etc. But the head was very much in favour of digital transformation. And very much bought into the idea of digital learning as a process. So the seeds were sown before COVID came along. During COVID, you can see there, and I won't read it all out, that there was an amazing jump there. But there's been, as they point out, a huge emotional impact on the staff, and staff exhaustion and absence in this period since restrictions were lifted, as you all know, has been quite considerable in schools. And he pointed out that when staff return, they look for comfort. They look for comfort in similar routines. And I think that's a really important cultural aspect of full school adaptation of ICT, because the culture of the organisation needs to be right in order to affect that substantial strategic change. It needs enthusiasm, and as he points out, everybody's shattered. And interestingly enough, very much questioning, you know, I question also, am I a good enough leader when the appetite for risk taking is low? Do I have the right skills to inspire staff and to continue with online learning? So this real tension between wanting to develop online learning further and the reality of the situation as it stands as we came out of a period of restrictions. And then the same person talks about the workforce feeling deprofessionalised. And as a leader, they have to handle this carefully. They don't feel like experts in the new world. And of course, we know from the literature in higher education, in online learning, that this is absolutely very, very common. My doctoral studies looked at the changing identities of associate lecturers at the Open University as they moved to fully online environments, and the hit on their professional identity was enormous, and this feeling of being deprofessionalized, etc., comes through quite loudly. What were the key insights that came out of the qualitative work? Well, Alan is going to talk about the quants research a little later on this morning, but there were some key insights that came out of this. One of them was collaborative agency, and that is not only collaborative agency between teachers, which is massively important, but also collaboration between schools. And collaboration indeed between MATs, where there had previously been no collaboration there. And I think this is really important, because coming back to that very marketized neoliberal environment within England, we have seen a dearth of collaboration between multi-academy trusts. And this actually changed with some trusts during the pandemic. There's been a new language of learning, so we've seen a lot of new terms embedded and practices changing because they've been labelled very differently. And one of those is the difference, obviously, between homework and home learning. We did see some heads who felt that they lacked the skills to take this forward and felt threatened. Whoops, sorry. Can you go back? Can I go back to the previous slide? Thank you. A lack of funds as well. Obviously, schools are in a difficult position with budgets, and goodness only knows what's going to happen in October when the energy goes up again. I don't even like to think about it. Some heads don't believe in digital learning. They just don't believe it's the right way to teach at secondary level. And that, of course, is hugely influential in relation to creating a culture of learning. And within those schools, throughout the narratives, we saw tension between what the heads wanted to do, which was largely return to business as usual, and what certain groups of teachers and middle leaders wanted to do in relation to capitalizing on all that learning that had gone on during the pandemic. So we finish with a framework for the analysis of digital strategic planning and implementation, which emerged as a result of our work, has emerged as a result of our work so far. And we're looking at 12 key areas. So within this framework, we would be looking at finance. Does the school have access to the financial resources needed to implement a whole school digital strategy? And those financial resources can be very considerable if the school is thinking of changing its premises to reflect a blended learning approach. Hardware and software speaks for itself. Inter-school collaboration. Is the school collaborating with external partners to implement the digital strategy? And we saw quite a few schools that were offering subjects that didn't have enough take-up in their own school, collaborating with others in order to offer subjects online and share resources between schools. I've mentioned the adaptation of physical buildings and the links to sustainability there as well. A couple of very forward-thinking heads were really linking it to the sustainable schools agenda. How are schools using digital to be fully inclusive? I mean, how did it work? How is it going to work with children who have particular educational needs? Or children who are in very challenging home situations. Point 6 is competencies. Are there plans to develop staff, parents and student competency in relation to digital skills? And number 7, are there plans to include pedagogical digital innovation linked to learning outcomes in the organisation? We then move on to point 8, which is well-being. Point 9, which is staff, and that's very much a cultural element. Are staff supportive of a move to blended learning? Do staff believe that there's a place for it in the school? Number 10 is evaluation. What are the plans that you have to evaluate digital learning? We saw some very forward-thinking efforts to do this during the pandemic. Virtual walks, corridor walks by head teachers, and peer-to-peer observation. But what are the plans going forward? What are the ethics? Do leaders really feel that digital learning is ethically and morally acceptable to be adopted as a whole school approach for your pupils and your staff, and considering within that teacher workload? And then finally, we have digital poverty. And how is digital poverty holding back the development of online learning and the development particularly of a digital strategy? And this framework for analysis is going forward for our next project, which I am in the process of putting together at the moment, which is taking the whole of the UK and looking at strategic planning for digital learning in the whole of the UK. And that project is being supported by all of the UK governments. So thank you very much. Happy to take questions. I think we're taking questions after Richard's spoken. So thank you.
That is great. Thank you very much, Jacqueline. You have given us a lot to think about, and this is indeed a fascinating piece of research. I know you and I have talked about it before, but it was actually great to see the details going into it. So yeah, just a minor correction to what I actually said in my introduction earlier. We do not have a dedicated Q&A slot after each individual presentation, but we actually have one after 2 presentations, which I will now move us on to Richard and his presentation on the role of digital technology in self-directed grassroots CPD. Over to you, Richard.
Everybody, and thanks very much for joining today and welcoming and inviting me along to talk about this. So yeah, my name's Richard. I'm a lecturer in education at the University of Dundee. I also head up the Master of Education programme. I've been working in the university for about 10 years now, and before that was a primary school teacher. I have a little bit of secondary school experience as well, mainly which was in England, although now I'm in Scotland. And today I'm going to talk about grassroots CPD or self-directed learning, the role of digital technology, and I'm also going to make a connection and link to leadership as well. So I thought I'd quickly start with where I am at the moment. As you might tell from my accent, I'm not originally Scottish. I'm from the northwest of England, although I did work predominantly in the northeast of England. I seem to be heading gradually further north, and I've now found myself in Dundee. So I always mention this whenever I give a presentation because Dundee's a great, vibrant, exciting city. It's developing really quickly, and we've got lots of reasons to come and visit. So if you get the opportunity, you should do so. We've got the Victoria and Albert Museum here now. We've got the research ship, Scott's research ship, the Discovery, down by the riverside, and lots of exciting things going on in the city. It's also home to DC Comics, who produced things like they'll still produce Beano and Dandy, and you can see in the city square there, Desperate Dan. We've also got the Eden Project Scotland, hopefully moving here in the next few years, and it will be the first Eden project outside in the UK, outside of England, with the obviously the one down in Cornwall as well. So that's my little bit for the Scottish Tourism Board and for Dundee, but I'm going to move on now to what I'm talking about, and I'm going to look to the next sort of 20 minutes or so at self-directed learning and what I call grassroots CPD, and how this has evolved during COVID-19 and builds on quite nicely from what Jackie was just talking about before. I'm then going to lead into how digital technology and things like virtual learning environments, online streaming, possible conference platforms, in particular social media, has facilitated this. And I've got a couple of polls in my presentation where you can have a go at answering the questions as we go, just to see to gauge your views as well. So if we start by looking at teacher professional development and learning, I'm sure we're all aware that the research suggests, it's quite clear, that if teachers have quality professional development, this will have a positive impact on learner outcome. And there's lots of research into this, in particular the study by Cordingley in 2015. Now, the terminology around an understanding of professional development and professional learning is disputed. The kind of catch-all term that people might know is CPD, although there is a debate between academics but also teachers and leaders in education about whether professional development and professional learning really are the same thing. And working in Scotland, the General Teaching Council for Scotland, who are the accrediting body, they use the term career-long professional learning. So for the teachers who are in classrooms, this can be a little bit confusing as to what we're talking about. I'm not overly bothered about the terminology and the definitions of it. I think they're quite sort of varied. So as long as we've got a general understanding about what we're talking about, I think it's fine. Now, historically, you're probably very familiar with CPD, PD, professional learning being top-down activity, quite hierarchical. If I think about my own time teaching, it would be sitting in a classroom at the end of the day, about 4 o'clock every Tuesday, and having some sort of training delivered to us through a staff meeting, maybe your inset days as well, if you're a teacher still, or if you remember those days. And I think the more I consider this, the more I think it equates to formal training. And there's also this connection to a reduction in feelings of ownership and control. And I was just looking at the standards for teaching for both England, which are very, very simple, just 1 or 2 page document, and also the standards for teachers in Scotland, which are far more complex and multi-page documents. Neither of them make any explicit reference to teachers developing their own knowledge and understanding. Now, in comparison, the General Medical Council, there is quite early on a reference to being kept up to date with skills and knowledge. And I think it's quite interesting that, given that we're in the business of learning, that our national standards in the UK, certainly in England and Scotland, don't really have this as a important upfront point. Now, moving on from this idea of formal learning, something that's possibly got more interest in the last sort of 10 years or so is this idea of informal learning. So Rogers proposes this iceberg metaphor. So an iceberg floating in the sea, 80–90% of that iceberg will be below the waterline, is the stuff that you don't see. And Rogers makes the suggestion that the 10 or 15% you see above the water is your formal learning. And that might be doing a university course, or it might be, learning formally on the job. But then what we get is this informal learning, and Rogers includes things like accidental learning, incidental learning, all within this informal learning categorization. And I think this has got real potential, and there's been quite significant developments in the last 10 or 15 years in this particular area. So this is what I would refer to as teachers taking ownership for their own professional learning. So some of you might be aware of things like TeachMeet events, EdCamp events in the United States, the BrewEd movement, which began around 2017 predominantly in England. In Scotland, there's a small movement called Pedagoo that organises or was organising pre-pandemic events, and also ResearchEd, which is a little controversial because of the political influences. So I acknowledge that this might not be the same as some of these other organisations. Social media has really facilitated this. So you've got hashtags such as EdChat, which help people find out more about these events, and really gathered momentum during lockdown and COVID. But other than the US-based EdCamps, which Jeff Carpenter has researched quite extensively, there's not really much research into this informal CPD, although there is some research into how social media has been used. Now, through my PhD, I use terms like DIY PD or teacher initiated, and I kind of settled on the term grassroots, but even that's controversial, with a couple of colleagues questioning whether some of these examples like ResearchEd really are grassroots or not. Now, one of the criticisms of this is, where is the quality assurance? So for leaders, especially in strategic roles, this might be a concern for them. So this takes us to our first question. So if you're able to have a go at this poll for us, what I want you to do here is just tell me your experience of grassroots or do-it-yourself professional development. Have you ever presented at a TeachMeet event, a BrewEd event, ResearchEd, or something similar to this? Have you attended one? Have you heard about them but not attended? Or have you not heard of them at all? So I'm just going to give you 30 seconds or so to answer that, and it will give us a bit of an idea as to whether you've been involved in this or not. So it seems to be showing that people have got a fair understanding of what they are, and some people actually have attended them, and also some people have presented them, which is quite good to hear, because as I said, there's not much research into this area, and I do talk to teachers when I visit schools, and some of them, a bit as like the poll is saying, perhaps haven't heard of them, aren't really sure what they are. So okay, so that's I'll move on from that. So thank you for engaging in that. So moving on from this, Jackie's talked about the impact of COVID-19, and obviously everybody faced huge challenges. I've not got a reference for that, but I think we probably accept that there were lots of difficulties. There was real impact for learners, and there were close family members, friends who have children, they talked about the difficulties of trying to educate whilst also do their working from home as well. And in some cases, there was quite a lot of confusion. Education Scotland, who oversee education north of the border, they organised through their online learning platform which all teachers have access to, a session to access and learn more about it. I attended that out of interest to see what they were talking about. And even the people leading the session, the digital experts, had problems. There were people getting locked out of rooms, people couldn't use the platforms. And I think that was a real illustration of the challenges everyone was facing. Now, alongside that, if we use Rogers' theory of incidental and accidental learning, there are lots of other opportunities. And there's an image there of my niece who's down in Preston. My brother and his wife were trying desperately to do their own jobs whilst also home educate their two daughters. So I joined Molly once or twice online, and we looked at some of the work that she was doing. She's up at primary school, and we did some sort of online lessons. And that was really good for me as a teacher educator to get a handle on how difficult it was for families and some of the challenges that the teachers were having with presenting the information. So I myself was learning in the same way that other people were learning accidentally and incidentally. So if I move back to grassroots, what I call grassroots CPD, and I'm going to give a couple of examples here now. So the first one is through the BrewEd movement. And this is the CPD events, which are quite similar to Teach Meets, and they're organised often in pubs. They don't have to be, they could be in a cafe or something. It's usually on a weekend, and a series of speakers sign up. So as we went into lockdown, the BrewEd movement, who communicate quite widely through the sort of wider professional learning network through Twitter, suggested that they would try and take something online. And after a short bit of discussion with various people, they decided to host it through a software called StreamYard, which was a free version available, which allowed you to embed your session, which would be live streamed through Twitter. So Graham Andre, who is a teacher down, I think he's in the Channel Islands, and you might have seen him on the TV show No More Boys and Girls. He features in that. He's the teacher in that. He hosted it from his living room. So he volunteered to do that. And basically the presentations were a range of live presentations or also some recorded ones that people put forward. It's really, really simple. So if you wanted to join this day, it ran from sort of 9 in the morning till about 4 in the afternoon. You just went to Twitter, you hit on the link. It was also through this StreamYard and Panopto software, so it was dead easy to get into. And if you wanted to watch back the entire day, it's available still online. It's still pinned. If you do a search for BrewEd Isolation, you should find it on Twitter. And so far, more than 18,000 people have viewed it. And it was a successful day, in my mind, anyway. Now, at the same time, alongside this, I myself was working with a colleague in the university. We'd been told basically that they were going to shut down by the end of the week. So we said, well, could we offer support for teachers who were having to move their teaching online, because we had a bit of experience of using technology and teaching online. So we set up, using the Scottish intranet site for teachers, which is called Glow, a small professional learning community using the Teams software. And we advertised this, and we got over 50 teachers joining that team. And then regularly every week or 2 weeks, we joined up with them online, and we had 6 or 7 teachers joining each week. And it quickly evolved from them asking us for help and advice to us sharing support, maybe informally, around some of the challenges we were facing, but also looking at things like the Black Lives Matter movement and how we could embed that into our teaching, how we could look at outdoor learning during lockdown when we were teaching remotely, and lots of different topics. The Glow intranet platform itself provides another interesting case study. The Scottish Government invested heavily in this more than 10 years ago, and it's been a variable success. But when obviously lockdown took place, having this intranet in place, which all students and all teachers have access to, and included things like the Teams software, so people could access that, it proved to be quite helpful for that, although there were obviously challenges, as you can imagine. So I've got another question for you here to see what you think. So your own experience of learning through COVID-19, the last 2 years, and the periods of lockdown or returning from lockdown back to school or higher education, wherever it is you work. So did you really struggle, maybe feel disempowered? Maybe it's been a challenge, but you think you've learned some things, but to be honest, given the chance, you wouldn't do this again. Would you think that you've learned a lot and that perhaps you're a better educator or leader than you were due to the experience, or is it too complex to summarize? So again, I think you can just click on the vote and you can tell us what you think about this. So just trying to see how you've responded and how you've felt this, how this process has been. So Number one would be, yeah, learned quite a lot. I think I'm a better educator or leader due to experience. I've learned a lot, but it's been difficult. Perhaps a few things that I would have done that I could have done without this. Really struggled and disempowered, or is it just too complex? So I'll give you another few seconds or so to answer on this. So looking at the answers and the responses so far, it seems as if, yeah, people have learned. They've acknowledged that we've taken something away from it, although it has been a bit of a challenge. I think so. It's quite interesting to say that nobody felt completely disempowered. I think if it had gone on for a couple of months and then we'd gone back to normal, I think some people would have felt that way. But I think gradually over time, we did become a little bit more used to it. But it was interesting in Jackie's presentation, she talked about leaders wanting potentially to return to normal. And I work with teacher educators, I work with a lot of teachers, student teachers as well. And you do see that difference between them as to how they've managed with that. Okay, thank you for that. I will move on. So that the fact that some of the people have responded there and felt positive about it and see it as an opportunity, I think leads nicely into this next slide, which is about potential opportunities for future. So the question here is that COVID-19 shifted the way that we view our own learning. Well, it probably has, because it was that period of uncertainty and people did need to engage it. But I wonder how consciously teachers have regarded this and educators have regarded this as an opportunity for them to engage with informal and accidental learning. And I think this comes down to the fact that we don't perhaps value accidental and informal learning. It goes on all the time, but we're not, because it's so subconscious. We don't really think that this is something that is important to us. And in a schooling system, the way that we're driven by metrics and everything's result based, it's almost like we discount that value of it. So self-directed learning for teachers and formal CPD can work together, I think, but at the moment it's possibly not. So this would be an important point for anybody trying to use this idea of informal learning using digital technology to support this, is how we fit it in alongside that formal CPD and formal training. The idea of self-directed learning from Rogers or Hutagodji, building on the ideas of Knowles from the 70s, it could be given far greater prominence for teachers. And I think it's something we all need to talk about. I have heard from teachers who attend things like Teach Meet events and Brew Ed events that at times they're almost criticised by colleagues who say, why are you spending a Saturday going and doing this? And I can understand that people have lots of personal challenges and problems in their lives that mean they haven't got time to engage with this, but equally the people engaged in it perhaps shouldn't be felt that they have to sort of almost keep it quiet as well. So maybe we need to view education differently. It makes me think a lot of Ivan Illich's work about deschooling society, and can we view education differently. So I suppose a reflection point for us all could be, how has your learning changed during this period? So this is something to think a little bit about later, and what have you learned, and trying to make some of these ideas more concrete in your mind. And then this moves on to opportunities for leaders in schools. So what would this mean to us? Well, there are opportunities with hybrid technology, and universities are trying to use this. It's also known as here or there technology. So you're having people physically in the room with you, but also people joining online. So for students who maybe have health issues, for people who want to study remotely, there may be the opportunity for greater collaboration. We can obviously link up with schools around the world as well. So this could lead to opportunities that are more democratic. So grassroots CPD often flattens the structures. It's not as hierarchical as historically it's been. But does formal education really want things to be democratic? It's difficult to say. And it is hard to manage, because grassroots professional development, digital technology, these things move fast. Teach Meets began in 2006, and very quickly the technology, the wiki technology that drove them, it became outdated. It moved on to these ideas of brew eds and things like that. So these things evolve very, very quickly. And so there could be an opportunity for quite high rewards, but also a failure rate, which is something we're not very keen on in schools and in education. So this takes us on to this idea of autonomy and agency in digital learning. So it does give learners greater freedoms, but it might be uncomfortable for them. So how can we do it effectively? I think one of the things is to build community collaboration, find common goals. And this is very similar to the research into effective CPD. So if it's community-based, it's collaborative, it's working towards what the learner outcome is. For leaders and teachers, trust is a critical factor. And the work from Megan and Shannon Moran in the US talks about this and building trust. So leaders need to show vulnerability and perhaps showing that things haven't worked, have been a failure is okay to talk about that. We can learn from that. And something that I almost want to finish up on here, nearly one of my last points, is this idea about false humility. So we would never admit that we weren't very good with technology, with literacy, say, and numeracy less so. Although sometimes people say I'm terrible at numeracy and maths, but technology, it does seem to be for some people just to sort of say, oh, well, that's okay, I'm terrible at tech, and almost opt out of it. But whether we like it or not, there is a lot of this here to stay. So we need to trust ourselves to integrate technology into our professional development. We need to have high expectations. Possibly doing nothing is not an option. Be open to discussion and debate. And the small professional learning community that I was involved with, we certainly did that. And it was over a period of time. So we need this space to foster these communities of practice as well. Recognize things like blogging and social media, maybe that we can attend in person or possibly online as well. And maybe have some sort of minimum threshold expectation. And perhaps for people in teacher education, we do need to formally teach digital and research literacy. We expect minimum standards for literacy and numeracy in our teachers and educators, but do we really have that same for digital technology as well? So I've got one last question for you very quickly. So do you think that digital technology has a future in professional development? So number one, should leaders be utilizing digital technology for education and professional development? Do we perhaps need to, a bit like Jackie was saying, get back to face-to-face PD, as Jackie said, some leaders in education we're keen to do, or not sure? So last question for you. What do you think there? I'll just give you a few seconds to answer that. And apologies, Jacqueline, for calling you Jackie throughout today. And that's the end. So thank you very much, everybody, for listening. Much appreciated. And I think we possibly have time to a couple of quick questions. Lydia, back to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Richard. Again, more food for thought from you. And yes, this is correct. We do have some time now to take questions. We do have a few questions that have come through, and also we'll be able to unpack some of those concepts. And I think there are a few overlaps between yours and Jacqueline's presentation. There is a question for Jacqueline, which says, where any alternative provision schools or academies considered to be included in the research. And I suppose it'd be interesting to hear, in your experience and from the data, what were some of the key differences in the voice of the leaders between, say, multi-academy trusts and LA maintained based leaders?
Yes, that's an interesting question. We didn't set out to see what the differences were, particularly between between academies and LA maintained schools. We didn't set out to do that. So I can only say what the difference was between multi-academy trusts and standalone academies. And maintained schools. And the multi-academy trusts, because they were speaking from a CEO perspective, obviously their strategic approach, particularly when they were implementing a whole organization approach, was being fed by the schools that they worked with, and had been encouraged by quite a lot of the head teachers in cases where that occurred. They also tended to have very powerful relationships with platform providers, which also influenced the financial resources available to take that whole school a whole organization strategic approach. Whereas with the standalone academies and the maintained schools, and I mean, obviously we're going to be looking very closely at the differences when we expand this project to the whole of the UK. But the differences were that the approach appeared to be quite often held up by culture, and there seemed to be cultural barriers where schools hadn't moved on. And in the couple of occasions where schools had actually regressed, and I have to say that both of those were in areas of high socioeconomic deprivation, it was largely because they just couldn't face the level of culture change needed to implement that level of change at this particular point in time. And I think coming back to what I said earlier about the article in Schools Week that Toby Greene tweeted about earlier, you know, it's the massive pressure is enough to quash anybody's innovation. And I think although a lot of learning had taken place during the pandemic with those schools, they just simply didn't have the energy or the financial resources or material resources because of staff exhaustion to actually keep up the momentum that happened during the crisis period. And I think if you look across the literature on innovation post-crisis in the organizational studies literature, you see that this is common, that some organizations will build, but only if they have the material and cultural resources to be able to do the build on the learning that took place, whereas others will regress because either school leaders or organizational leaders haven't got the appetite for it after having coped for so long in a crisis period. And as I said earlier, we're not out of the woods yet, it's still crisis period in schools. Or they lack the material financial resources to really drive this through. And I think another barrier as well, you know, which comes across is that digital poverty, is the fact that some students just do not have the study space, they do not have the bandwidth at home, and they do not have the support at home to be able to effectively engage with blended learning at the moment. So I hope that partly answers the question. I answered it as well as I can at this point in time anyway.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, Jacqueline, is that sort of your understanding of how you would explain the fact that, I think you mentioned in your presentation that there was only, I think, one school that was in a low socioeconomic sort of SED area that actually made the leap from one category to sort of a more to a deeper kind of higher level category? Would that be your explanation for it?
Yeah, I mean, they made smaller leaps, you know, and we only, I mean, to be fair, we only got 2 schools in the entire study that had apparently regressed to what they were doing before the pandemic. But yes, I mean, that digital poverty is massive, and it's something that needs to be dealt with at policy level. And that is why I think that the governments have all said that they want to support the extended bid, because they need to know the scale of the digital poverty, because otherwise, in my view, it's going to hold up digital innovation for the foreseeable future, when we should be pushing on and we should be moving on and we should be looking at the sustainable schools of agenda and thinking, how can I you know, cut down on paper, cut down on travel, reduce our carbon emissions, and it's all bundled up as one. So yeah, it's a great challenge, but I don't honestly think that it's something that school leaders alone can solve. This is policy. This is society. Yeah.
Exactly. Richard, I'll come on to you in a second. I just want to, since we are on this specific topic, I have another follow-up question about, you mentioned, Jacqueline, that you talked about the tension between what the leaders wanted and what some groups of teachers were pushing towards. And I was just wondering, how was this tension managed? And to what extent was this tension, this pressure from below, able to moderate this resistance to change, if you like? So what was the interaction between, I think you mentioned one of the important factors, for example, was the leaders' attitudes and their beliefs about what digital learning can do. And at times that was in contrast with what some groups of teachers thought. So I was just wondering, did you have any insights in terms of how this tension was managed at the local level? I think you're on mute, Jacqueline.
Sorry, Lydia, was that for me or Richard?
That was for you.
All right. Well, I think the heads were reluctant to push staff who did feel alienated. I think precisely because they're still in crisis mode. I mean, I think that when and if we come out of crisis mode in education, it may move on, but at the moment, you can understand with the levels of mental ill health amongst teachers and amongst students, combined with the pressures of staff absence, etc., and also the perceptible lack by some leaders of feelings of expertise in the digital world themselves. I mean, I think a lot of school leaders saw stuff that teachers were doing during the pandemic and were completely and utterly awestruck and gobsmacked by the innovation and the level of expertise and what they were actually doing with the pupils at the time. And I think that there's that tentative, can I push them? Should I push them? Or should we just retain the status quo until things get a little bit more settled? I think you've also got to bear in mind that with the CEOs that we interviewed that were, leading these multi-academy trusts, a CEO essentially is operating at a hugely strategic level. And whilst obviously the resources, etc., were being poured into the development and the strategic planning, and the governors were on board, there is still a question mark about drilling down to how the middle leaders feel and how the heads of the individual academies feel. And I think this was crisis funding. I did ask to go to middle leadership from the funder. The funder refused, and I had to amend the bid just to embrace the senior leadership teams. But I mean, to my mind, that is a flaw in the research, because I think taking what CEOs, taking the perspective of a CEO doesn't tell you necessarily what the culture change is doing on the ground. And I think that, I have pointed it out in subsequent writing. That's a caveat to the study, and something that we'll address in the next project, definitely.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And were there, just to clarify, were there any alternative provisions included in the research?
Alternative provision, in what sense? Do you mean fully online schools or special schools?
I'm thinking PRUs, for example, pupil referral units.
There were no pure pupil referral units, but there were 2 academy trusts that had PRUs within the academy trust. Yeah, but we couldn't, as I say, this was at a very high strategic level, and we couldn't drill down so much within the multi-academy trusts to the individual school level, because, as I say, it was out of scope for this particular study. Yeah.
Mhm,
It's a
mhm.
really interesting area, though, to look at. And I mean, there was certainly a lot came out of it in relation to special educational needs and how that might develop afterwards. And I think what Head said was, a lot of them said, you know, their communication with parents, and particularly parents of children with these additional needs, and parents who wouldn't normally attend parent-teacher nights and were quite difficult to reach. And you know, heads were having a more intense relationship with these parents. And I think that also in itself was liberating in terms of being able to see the challenges there, but also a little bit terrifying as well, because I don't think some of them had penetrated those particular scenarios and those particular households to that degree ever before. So I think, again, I mean, that's very interesting to us, because in terms of strategy as learning, I think that might be really interesting going forward, the fact that they have had to engage on that level, and how that's going to affect their strategic planning in the future.
Exactly.
Yeah, but
And
there is a certain
Mhm.
amount as well, as I say, of you know, of CEOs putting a gloss on it, and especially if they're enthusiastic, and that's not a criticism of them, it's just a fact of the way that the research was structured, really.
I do have further questions. I want to move on to Richard with just a quick question before we move on to a 5-minute comfort break. So, Richard, there's a question for you. Not sure if you've conducted research on this, but does the Teacher PLC on Glow show any theme or focused conversation on digital teaching and learning?
Yeah, we've not published anything formally with the participants, but me and my colleague Tara did it's a chapter we've had, I think it's being published at the moment, about our experiences. And I suppose to sort of sum up that, the difficulty was the people who came to it were the people who had a fair level of comfort with digital tech and were also these sort of self-directed learners anyway. There was also a personal connection to all of them. They were all people that we had some link to, possibly through teacher education before. And I think that replicates what we know about, especially informal learning, and that you want to have that group of people you can work alongside. It started with us looking at digital approaches to learning online. So, for example, one of the questions was, right, let's go away. We'd pose a question, the week later, we'd go and look at it ourselves, research it, come back and contribute to what we might do. But one was, how on earth do we do outdoor learning when we're only allowed out for an hour or so? So we went away, we read some research, we looked into it. And I, you know, some tools where I said, you know, you could use something like a mapping tool and you get the children to explore their local area and set some challenges, and they could maybe use their phones to take some images and share it. So we came up with some teaching and learning methods together for that. We quickly moved away from the digital tech side of it, really, to it just being a different way for it to be almost a support mechanism. And the other thing was, the people who had attended then got a bit more confident. They would lead sessions and they would suggest things. And some of the sessions that we attended, we didn't really do very much. We just, as teacher educators, we just listened to them, and they, you know, and they brought their ideas to us, and we got a huge amount out of that. So I think, like with any CPD and any professional learning, the difficulty is one size fits all. So if you think of your traditional inset, and Scotland local authorities still organise this, they'll bring all the primary teachers together from, could be 100 of them sitting in a room. Well, you've got somebody that's a year into their job, with somebody who's 20 years in, somebody that's only ever taught nursery or, you know, reception age, and somebody else that's taught mainly upper school. It doesn't really work, you know. So I think one of the opportunities is to have this really small tailored CPD, but it's only a small number of people who will engage with it because of all the other challenges, time and everything else that's going on. So I think we're at the beginning of this, and there will be people wanting, as Jacqueline said, wanting to go back to the way it always was. And I see that in the university. You see people, colleagues who desperate to get back to face-to-face, and despite investing in hybrid technology so we can deliver face-to-face and we can have people joining online if they need to, there's a bit of a reluctance from quite a lot of people to do that. They want to get back in a room, they're comfortable with that, and understandably you have to teach differently. You have to teach differently when you're online. That was something else that we discovered. A theme was, you can't, when you're teaching a 1 hour session, I found it teaching my niece Molly for nice and easy. I know her well, and it was one-to-one, 40, 50 minutes, and it was quite straightforward to do that. But you had to simplify things, and seeing some of the resources that teachers were putting up, they weren't quite getting it. That you needed to have it very simple for parents who were supporting or family members. You couldn't do the normal things that you would do. So I suppose that they were some of the themes that came out of it. But it was fascinating period.
Jacqueline?
Yeah, can I just ask Richard? So, I mean, do you think, what do you think that these, what do you think is really needed then to because it's very common with any subject, isn't it? It's like if you learn a different language, but you already know a bit of French, you tend to regress to what you know, don't you? Because you feel more comfortable with it. Well, what pushes it? What pushes them over that threshold, do you think, Richard?
I really don't know. Because I've always come around to now that there should be some form of mandatory training in some of these things, but then everyone's going to have an opinion about what you should be trained in. It's kind of the, it's the antithesis to what I'm saying would be valuable. I also think this idea about attitudinal development should be something that we talk about in professional learning. And I do look at medicine a lot. I know a lot of people who are doctors and people I was at university with, and they seem to have this ingrained attitude that we are there to learn, whereas I think teaching, because of the hierarchical nature, the structured, organized system to it, you can almost be sniffed at. Again, with someone going to a brew out, colleagues saying, what you're wasting your time on a Saturday for that? What do you want to do? Go learn something for? You're a teacher, and it's more about the delivery of packets of knowledge to people, or skills, or whatever it might be. So that attitudinal development perhaps should be at the center of what we do. But even that, is debatable. My views on what your attitude to learning should be will differ to everybody else's. So it is complex. That might be the only thing I could perhaps say on that.
I think you're absolutely. I think that's so interesting, because I've seen that in the medical profession as well. They kind of, well, this is what's happening, so we better get our heads around it. Whereas there is that. It's interesting that you see that kind of resistance. Yeah. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Jacqueline and Richard, and to everyone for your questions. I think it's time to move us on swiftly to a very quick comfort break, and we will have time to pick up on questions that we have not been able to address, as I said earlier, during the plenary session. So how about we reconvene at maybe 24, 25 past? Is that okay? All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone, and see you shortly. Bye-bye.
Dior, can you just confirm that you can hear and see?
Alan, I'm here and I can hear you. All good. All right, welcome back, everyone, to the second part of our webinar on digital leadership and cultural changes, challenges, and opportunities for schools. And we will start this second part with a presentation by Professor Alan Floyd. Welcome, and over to you to talk to us about challenges and opportunities of leading online learning.
Okay, thanks, Lydia. Good morning, everyone. My name's Alan. I work at the Institute of Education at the University of Reading, and delighted to be here today to talk a bit about some of the work that I've been doing with the project that Jacqueline outlined at the start. And I'm just going to go through some of the initial findings from our work. We've been doing a mixed methods study. This is the project. It's called Leading School Learning Through COVID-19 and Beyond. Collaboration funded by the UKRI. Led by Jacqueline at the Open University, and I'm the co-I on this particular project. And we're looking at a staged mixed methods study. We did an initial literature review and also analysis, as Jacqueline mentioned, of the websites of a number of schools. And then we've undertaken interviews with CEOs and heads. We're looking also at doing some interviews with governors, which we're embarking on at the moment. And the bit of work that we're going to look at today is the online survey. And we're looking at the moment, looking at that for head teachers, but we're also possibly looking at that as well for chairs and governors in the future. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about what the survey was and how it was developed. We went through a sort of a 6-stage process to ensure validity in questionnaire design. This was following guidelines from Gelbach and Brinkworth. So what did we do first? We drafted an initial survey following the literature review, and we did some pilot interviews with head teachers, and that was to try and get some of the emerging themes out from what was happening in relation to the restrictions. We then sent that out for peer review, got some comments back, made some changes. We then were working with a statistician to ensure that the inferential statistical work that we'll do at the end of the survey was appropriate, making sure that the questions were worded in the correct way. And then we also worked with advisors and our project partners and led a sort of focus group meeting to go through each of the questions, and that was to look at validity of terminology, whether the appropriate wording was being used, and those kind of things. So several changes were made during that process as well. And then we moved to a traditional kind of full pilot of the survey, and some changes were made on the basis of that as well. So the survey was 5 sections. We had 34 questions. The first section was about you, so basic demographics. Then we had a section about the school itself. And then, as Jacqueline has already mentioned, we were interested in looking at learning strategies and practices before restrictions, during the restrictions, and then after the restrictions are lifted, and looking to the future. So those were the 5 core areas. We had a range of type of questions. So we had some closed questions, ranking questions, Likert scale. We had some open comments sections, and we also had the ability to ask people to sign up for follow-up interviews. So we were hoping that this would give us a range of data that we would be able to get some really good insight into what was going on during this process. So there are very roughly 3,500 secondary schools in England. We're looking for an uptake of about 10% if we can, so we're looking at 350. So what I'm going to talk to you today is about the numbers so far. We've got 65 so far. We've actually found it very challenging to recruit on the survey. I think that's, we've spoken to other people who are researching in both internationally and nationally in the same areas, and there seems to be because heads have been bombarded essentially over the last 2.5 years. I think anything that comes in with the word COVID on it is an immediate kind of red flag. But we're going to be working hard over the next couple of months to increase that uptake. We've sent it out to partners. We're using Twitter, things like that, and we'll also be doing some individual one-to-one invitations. So what I'm going to talk to you today about is the initial findings from these schools. These are the range of schools that we have so far. You can see we're across a number of different school types. Someone asked about AP earlier on. We have one. The other there is alternative provision provider. But you can see there's a range of different types there. These are the school sizes. Again, just to look at the kind of spread of the scale of the schools that we've got. And we also asked whether they were parts of multi-academy trusts or not. Because again, as Jacqueline mentioned, we're looking at this idea of collaboration across MATs and how that works in relation to working in very sort of high pressured situations. We are interested, as Jacqueline mentioned, in looking at the impact of these restrictions on particular groups. So we are interested in asking schools about their percentage of pupils with SEND on school roll. And so that gives you an indication of the type of schools that have answered so far. We're also interested in similar notions related to free school meals. That's what FSM means, free school meals. So it gives an indication of socioeconomic status. It's a very crude indication, obviously, but it is one that is nationally used. And you'll see we have a spread there again of different types of schools with different percentages of children on free school meals on their roll. And the third area we're interested in is English as an additional language. And again, we have a spread of schools at the moment, because what we're going to be doing once we get our final results is doing some statistical analysis, looking at the differences between these groups, and whether they've been impacted harder or lesser extent by the restrictions. Okay, so here are some of the challenges that we looked at. So Jacqueline mentioned that the framework that we used for the interview analysis, and we're also looking similarly at the survey data on this. So we've split things up into the challenges that people have identified and the opportunities, because there have been some positive things, as we've been talking about this morning, that have emerged from this process. So there was only 14 schools of the 65 who stated that online learning was fully embedded before restrictions were introduced. So that clearly indicates that there's going to be some key challenges in trying to up skill and make sure schools could embark on online learning during the first lockdown. And I think this was seen, I mean, I had 2 children at home personally, and I think you could see at that stage schools really, some schools were sort of stuck a little bit sort of rabbit in headlights, because it was just so quick that they hadn't had any chance to move or implement any real online strategies at that stage. One of the key things that we found was that the over half the schools had found that they'd changed the person leading online learning, and obviously that's got issues around professional development and links to the earlier work that Richard was talking about. And so, you know, again, something that needs to be thought through is how do we help staff engage in professional development, appropriate professional development, to allow them to run these strategies appropriately. So these are the different people, and you'll see that it's very much spread throughout the school. There are some where the head teacher is involved, but there are obviously quite a lot of distribution of those kind of processes, so that we can see that there are some subject leaders, teachers also getting involved at an individual level as well. So as I mentioned, this is a key issues for staff development. So one of the questions we asked was the key challenges, what they felt were the key challenges during the restrictions. And I just thought it would be useful for you in the audience just to have a think about what you thought those might be. So we've got 5 key challenges. Maybe if you just link to what you think might be the biggest challenge that schools may have faced at that particular time. I'll just give you a couple of a minute or so to engage with that. So it looks like lack of equipment is seen as the biggest challenge, and that certainly did come through. We've also got lack of parental support, lack of staff expertise, behaviour management. Behaviour management was an interesting one because that was being talked about quite a lot in the media, but actually just in from our own findings, we found that the 3 key ones were lack of staff expertise, lack of pupil expertise, and indeed the lack of equipment as the key challenges. And so these are issues that need to be thought through as we move forward. And again, links to notions of professional development, but also links to the idea that those that have poor access are going to be impacted the most in relation to online learning. There was key support that leaders wanted, felt that would have helped them. These included curriculum support, hardware and software support. They were able to access hardware support from the government, but that was quite often difficult, and stuff didn't arrive, and there were some problems with that. And you'll see there again, staff development and guidance comes up as a core issue. So as I mentioned, we asked staff, we asked heads about whether they felt that head teachers were, that pupils with special educational needs or English as a foreign additional language or on free school meals were able to engage fully. And they were reasonably encouraging, but there was still a worrying number who felt that they had not been able to. So just to show you the data here on each of those groups. So for SEND, we had 10 schools who felt that those children were not able to fully engage. For EAL, it was 21. And for pupils on free school meals, it was 11. So these are things that we need to think about, and certainly shows that there were these people in these groups were disproportionately negatively affected. Okay, so I'm going to move forward now to some of the opportunities, to some of the more positive aspects. And we certainly found from the data that there seemed to be a big step change as we moved from the first to the second lockdown in relation to what online learning was implemented and the types of activities. So these were the various types of activities. And what we can see when we look at the changes from first to second is that only 9 schools suggested that they hadn't done any real changes. All the others had felt that they had implemented more different strategies for online learning. And this seems to show this more sort of pedagogical innovation and creativity. And this was coming out from our interviews as well. So these data suggest that there really was a shift in people's thinking around how we can best help our learners in these situations. Other positive points were there was a lot of engagement with parents and pupils when developing online learning provision. So schools were actually engaged in things like surveys, social media, specially formed committees, and sort of regular email updates to try and engage with both parents and pupils in developing the provision. And that obviously suggests that there's an element of collaboration there, which perhaps didn't exist to that extent before restrictions were introduced. What was good was that the schools that did not have any online provision before they were introduced, so 19 of the 21 schools that didn't have any online provision going on, were going to implement some sort of online learning in the future. And all of these schools were going to embed it or fully semi-embed it within their moving forward, their curriculum moving forward. So I think that shows that there is an imagination of something beyond the restrictions that will be different, and will perhaps, again, linking to some of the things that Jacqueline and Richard were talking about, moving forward, people actually engaging in some of the key implementations that have gone on through the restrictions. And so just to draw to a close, these are the kind of questions I think from these data that we'll be looking at, implications for strategy, implications for digital leadership development, and implications for general staff development. And more as important, or the key implication really is, what does this mean for student learning? Our next steps are to continue recruiting, and then we're going to be doing some statistical analysis, some hypothesis testing of the survey, and that will allow, hopefully, we'll be able to get a more detailed picture than the very brief, broad brush findings that I've been able to talk to you today about. I've put a link to the survey there. And so if there are any head teachers or you know of head teachers in your networks, I'd be delighted if you could forward that on so we can increase the sample size. Okay, that's it from me.
Thank you very much, Alan. Thank you, and thank you for sharing the link as well. I think we all know as education researchers how difficult it is. Oh, sorry, I know you can't see me. How difficult it is to actually recruit schools for surveys such as these, and especially in such busy times. But I'm sure if you will share the link, perhaps that might be helpful. Right, there are a few questions, but we will look at these at the Q&A slot right after Serdar and Elizabeth's presentation. Right, and moving on to digital strategy in Scottish education, national policy and local initiatives. And over to you, Serdar. And I don't know if Elizabeth is going to be able to present live alongside you today, Serdar?
I don't know yet, but I think she
Okay.
said that she might join us in 10 minutes or so earlier. So yeah, I just see Liz there, so she's with us.
I'm here. Hi, everybody. I'm sorry.
Hello, Elizabeth, and welcome. Great to have you. Thank you for joining us. And over to you both.
Thank you very much, Lydia. So I'm going to start the presentation for our part, and in the last part, I'll hand it over to Liz to kind of tell her story in terms of this, I think, digital strategy in schools. And in my part, I would like to kind of talk more about the policy and policy implementation and kind of regional and local initiatives that's happening. Because I wanted to show where things are, how things are happening in Scottish context, and also partly due to, I think, my short time yet in Scotland, and been just completed 2 years of my post in University of Edinburgh, Moray House. Although I've done research in other areas, but this area is kind of I think ripe for research, but I haven't had a chance to look into that. But hopefully with the bit that I'm involved in with Jacqueline Baxter and others, we'll be able to look at it in the whole UK context. In terms of policy and strategy, this was before the pandemic really hit the entire education system, entire world. About 6 years ago, the Scottish government, announced and published a strategy about enhancing learning and teaching through the use of technology. And one of the reasons for doing that was to address the educational attainment gap there, and utilizing technology to improve teaching and learning. To achieve this strategy, they had set out four main objectives. For one, was about developing skills and confidence of their educators in the appropriate and effective use of digital technology and support learning and teaching. And also improving access in terms of hardware and software to all individuals, teachers and learners. And this would include the one-to-one device strategy that I'll come to in a minute. And also another objective was about ensuring that digital technology is a central consideration in all areas of the curriculum and assessment delivery. So in Scottish education, as now it's called Curriculum for Excellence Framework as its curriculum. And one of the 8 curricular areas is technology, and technologies has the digital literacy for learners in that curricular area, but it's also intended to be across all the curriculums. And also the fourth objective for this strategy was empowering leaders of change to drive innovation and investment in digital technology for learning and teaching. And I think that touches more on to leadership digital for digital strategy than the others. And of course, I mean, this was 6 years ago, but it's been slow in terms of implementation. So, when the pandemic came, I think the Scottish education was nowhere near to like completing this strategy, and so there was that disruption to education, as it did in every other part of the world. And I think probably the biggest disruption was about the online hybrid provision that my colleagues talked about earlier. Even though the strategy outlines these areas, there wasn't a particular focus on online provision, and that's what everybody had to do willingly or unwillingly overnight with the pandemic and lockdowns. One of the objectives was about increasing access, and this is just coming from the last year, as they announced that this is going forward, and this is a strategy, an objective about empowering all the learners by giving them a laptop or a tablet from the early years to all the way to high school. And I think by this news was announced, the implementation of this was about 20%, and so it's still going on. And I know from my own daughter in our local primary school that they just started giving the devices this term. But also, I think this kind of made it maybe easier to move forward for the local governments as well during the pandemic, as their focus wasn't so much about giving devices to all children in a particular school, but making sure that those who are in need during the pandemic were given devices and access to like internet. So that was part of a shift in strategy, but I think the right way to tackle the changes came in the pandemic. And the local authorities in different councils kind of take their own approach and timeline for this implementation. So they call it, I think, differently in different councils. For example, Midlothian calls it Midlothian calls it Equipped for Learning, whereas Edinburgh City Council is called Empowered Learning. I think Scottish Borders calls it the same name. So there is this local take to implementing this government strategy. And also related to empowering educators and giving them more confidence. I'm just from last summer, there was this change in an update to GTCS standards, and GTCS standing for General Teaching Council for Scotland, who is the accrediting body for teaching profession. So they released an update to their professional standards for probationary teachers and full license teachers. And as highlighted in this page and the next is there's more emphasis into digital technologies, digital literacy, and how to use it in more pedagogical ways. So curriculum design, professional pedagogical theories and practice are all updated with an emphasis on digital technologies and digital literacy, as well as the professional skills and abilities. This kind of links to also the teacher education programs at universities. At Moray House in Edinburgh, I am part of the teacher education program, particularly in PGD primary. And there is this partnership and making sure that teacher education programs are aligning with the standards that are issued by the GTCS. So there is this, I think, initial start to implementing this more and more in the teacher education programs, and that's the formal education part. And that's, I'm not going to go too much into that because there is probably a topic for another session. There's so much there to talk about teacher professional development, as the focus here is more on the leadership for digital strategies. I'll leave that here. But there is also university engagement and involvement in other parts that touches on digital strategy and leadership. So one project that was just before the pandemic was this called the City Region Deal. And this is in full name Edinburgh and Surrey, Scotland City Region Deal. And this was in the works a couple years before the pandemic. And in 2018 was agreed by UK and Scottish governments and the City Region Deal partners in 2018. And this is a big initiative for Scotland, including the educational sector. And it aims to help establish the region, Edinburgh and surrounding region, as the data capital of Europe, and drawing more and more investment and fueling entrepreneurship, delivering economic growth. And just to look at quick numbers on this initiative and deal is, there is a investment more than 1 billion total investment into this initiative, and 25 million pounds of this is earmarked for skills development at all levels, including professional learning and university level learning, as well as the primary and secondary education. And University of Edinburgh is a big partner in this project because they kind of touch on to different areas. One thing that I want to highlight here is that is linked to the education. And I'm part of this project called Data Education in Schools. And this it looks at the primary and secondary part in that City Region Deal. And the vision for this project is that all children in the City Region Deal, which covers 5 local authorities, including City of Edinburgh and surrounding ones, will have the opportunity to excel in data education, regardless of their gender, location, and financial circumstances. So this ensures funding and availability of education for all learners. That's about over 120 learners across the region over 8 years. And this is done directly, either directly engaging with learners through the project, as well as upskilling and supporting teachers and school leaders in this time period. So what the project does is it pulls together a coherent data curriculum, drawing on the expectations and outcomes from existing subject areas like the computing science or mathematics or statistics, and also based on that, building on that, developing, collating, and curating teaching materials to match the curriculum. And if anybody's interested, they can go on to Data Education in Schools website that I linked at in the previous link page, and look at the resources and the materials and teaching materials, not just in the forms of lesson plans, but also we regularly present seminars and do live lessons that engages both learners and teachers. And also the project aims to establish professional learning networks for teachers, and that's currently supported by project offices, by academic leads, including us. But eventually, in the long run, we hope to achieve a self-sustaining professional learning community, which we call knowledge sharing communities. Then they can help and support each other. And lastly, the project aims to do help with e-placement, working with e-placement Scotland and employers to provide the work experience and placements and apprenticeship that feeds into the workforce. So the education feeding into the workforce. And one example, I think, project that I can highlight from this bigger project is this made the news, I think, in November or December. But again, support from the Scottish government for hardware. So the small project we call Internet of Things schools gives schools in this southeast Scotland region the devices, sensors, including carbon dioxide, light, temperature, air pressure sensors, in the hands of learners, in the hands of children, and all the data that's feeding into these from these sensors into a shareable, data feed that then they can take and analyze data, identify the patterns in data, and come up with questions and solve these problems looking at the data. Hopefully, then educating them, upskilling them about data education. And interestingly, around I think in December, when there was this earthquake around the volcano in Pacific, triggered big air pressure in the region, and they noticed around the same time in the school there was a change in air pressure, and they just thought of this question about are these events connected, and they were able to connect to a geologist in another part of the world and kind of answer this question. So it gives lots of opportunities to learners and teachers to utilize technology that way. And I also have to, I think, mention that in terms of linking this to leadership, is this project is actually comes with a teacher buyout, which then the school needs to agree on, taking some teachers' time into the project, allowing that to happen so that the teachers can get support, can have time to think about how they can integrate these technologies into their curriculum and then implement that into the classroom. And that definitely requires support from the school leadership. But this is also happening at the school level. So there is no direct push from like local authorities or from the government saying, you need to do this now. And we're actually recruiting schools. And this was one of the pilot schools there. So we intend to deliver this initiative to all schools in the City Deal. Another I think national effort, but not coming from the government, is the something called Digital Skills Awards. And the page that you see here is just for the Scotland, but this Digital Skills Award is available to, I think, in Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Republic of Ireland. And the intent with this is to promote, recognize, and encourage a whole school approach instead of piece by piece, self-directed by teachers. A whole school approach to using digital technology in all levels of education in Scotland. And now they have a second one on cyber resilience and internet safety. At the school level, they can basically start with registering their schools if they have interest into becoming a digital school. And then they self-evaluate themselves using the criteria that's provided through the system. And this criteria includes 5 headings, and this includes leadership and vision, and use of digital technology to deliver across the curriculum, and not just technology areas, and school culture change, something I think my colleagues talked about earlier, and professional development. How do we support teachers and formally and informal professional development as well, and what resources and infrastructure are available and can be made available to ensure that they meet the criteria to become a digital school. I'm trying to see, I think, yeah. There are schools, I think, with this program, nearly 5,000 schools are registered in Scotland, and about 25% of them awarded digital schools so far. So it's kind of gaining traction. Then it's also incentivizing schools to take the whole school approach to change their strategy for teaching and learning. and I mean, I think these are opportunities that can be harnessed for that shift and culture change, but also comes with lots of challenges in terms of especially doing this in the middle of the pandemic. I know one of these schools in my area that we agreed to do a project evaluation project with them, and had to add so much disruption to that and eventually pause this project because of the pressures coming due to the pandemic, staff absence and student problems, provisions for online learning just makes it very challenging to kind of follow up the course of making this change. I think one of the the disruption of COVID was that this everybody was caught in shock, and some things were not ready, such as the online learning provision. And by the way, I think I also want to say about the online learning provision and in the pandemic context, and this is also evident in the literature, and this is something related to my background in educational technology. I mean, online learning has been in place, especially in higher education, for years now. We have a good idea of how to do online learning, but what happened during the pandemic wasn't quite how it's written in the literature, how it's described, because that is kind of volitional, planned online learning, as opposed to what is called for online learning in the pandemic was emergency remote education, which doesn't follow the same kind of recipe for switching overnight. And I think in terms of developing strategies for schools, it's important to recognize the differences in how is what we're provisioning or planning to be ready in such an event in the future, as opposed to is hybrid learning or blended learning part of our strategy looking forward for our educational delivery methods. And lastly, about I think 7-8 minutes, I want to turn this to now my co-conspirator Liz Craig from Eyemouth Primary School in Scottish Borders. My connection to Liz was actually through a mentoring program that I got an email through me. I think it's called South of Scotland's Digital Skills Hub, and they were looking for mentors from universities to pair with teachers in the Scottish Borders area to help with the upskilling program. And I agreed to be a mentor, and I was matched with Liz. That's how our relationship started. And she is an inspired strategic lead in her school and in her area. And I wanted to kind of give her the stage to speak from her experience. So please take it over, Liz.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me today. And I am sorry I've missed the first part, and I'm going to have to sneak away at the end of this as well, because I'm in class. But yeah, so I am just going to talk a little bit about what we're doing down in the Scottish Borders in regards to our digital technology and using that as a tool for, well, we had to in the pandemic, which was not what we expected the first trial of this to look like, but in some ways it was the best way to get us all completely embedded into our technology and get the children up to speed with how it could be used and upskill as many people at the same time as we could. So that was really the start. So the Inspire project, if you just click on, basically there was money in our budget, and we were after lots of data was collected about where we think the focus should be in our schools, and where perhaps we're not quite as forward thinking as we could be. And digital technology kept coming back, and it was a big thing about staff confidence, and then also devices and getting connectivity in the schools. That was a big thing. So the Inspire project was born from that data, looking at where we can kind of put the money and how we should best implement it. And so we have looked at other countries that use similar things. There's a list of them on this slide, and kind of used little bits and pieces from those projects to create Inspire. And so it was really to look at not just giving these children a device, but how that device is going to help raise attainment, completely support the equality and equity in our schools, and the inclusion for all children and young learners. And so we decided that every child from P4 to S6 would have a device, and the device we went for, if you slide on, Serdar, was Apple. It was the iPad. We have connections with Apple through our CGI kind of governing body with our technology is CGI, and they had a relationship with Apple already. But further than that, the iPad just provided everything we needed. It has a huge push in Apple about education and closing attainment gaps and looking for equity for all. Its accessibility features, well, they're all always free. So on an iPad, all the accessibility features you'll find are free, because that's something they really, really want to promote. And that was obviously very close to our hearts with our learners in our schools. So Apple and CGI went into partnership, and we were able to get the iPad. We have P4s that come in, they get an iPad, and it's set up with them with their Apple IDs, with their Glow email accounts. Everything is there, and it's got a full suite of apps that come with the iPad. But we are constantly looking at what other apps might support our learning and other things that maybe we could invest in. And so there is money there to buy licenses for more apps that aren't already included on our the suite of apps that get given to us. So we're constantly evolving, constantly using the iPads, hopefully to the best of their ability. So if we just swipe on, that was just a wee wordy one. So to really help implement this program and to make it as worthwhile as we could, we realized that actually now that we were through COVID, it was very much just kind of make the best of it. We used a platform called Seesaw, and it was being able to plan and implement lessons virtually. Again, keep that connectivity with our children. It was an unprecedented set of series of events that left a lot of our families feeling isolated. So our technology was a really holistic way of keeping that connection going and support, and also looking at attainment and keeping that learning progressing. But when we came back to school, it was very clear that there was a bit of a chasm in staff confidence and knowledge, and how actually do use this device, not just to consume, but to create. And that was the big thing. So we are part of the Inspire Strategic Lead Programme. So across the borders, we have got several clusters, and there is a lead in every cluster. I am the one for iMouth cluster, and it's really my job to engage in the training and the experiences of others, and to gather good feedback and to gather good practice and to share it amongst my staff members and to support them to use this technology to the best of its ability. This year we've also had a focus. Apple have created this Apple Learning Coach program, and we are the first body outside of the US to use it. So I have just completed my Apple coaching course. So I'm going to go further into my strategic lead program and start properly coaching staff members across the cluster and authority, because we do a lot of across authority initiatives, to really try and get the best that we can and to upskill as many people as we can, so that it's not a lottery which cluster you land in. All the staff teams, all the staff groups are kind of we're uniformed in our training and our delivery and our expectations of our digital technology, really making it the heart of our curriculum. So that's going to be really exciting, and that's going to be COVID kind of restrictions are fading away, and so we're going to get much more kind of on the ground time with children and with other staff members, which is fantastic. If you just swipe on, Serdar. So how we use it in the classroom just now is basically all those things I told about, all the apps that Apple provided us, all of the usual IT lessons that you would love to engage in, but sometimes can't because you don't have the technology available. We can now do that. We now have free rein to do that. Our children are coming to us more digitally literate than some of our staff members are, and it's really taking that background knowledge and enhancing it to still deliver the same intended learning outcomes, but in a far more creative and authentic way for the learner sitting in our classroom. So we can plan lessons, we can implement lessons, we can give quality feedback in a variety of ways, and we can use what is given to us data-wise to then build upon that and to plan further learning and further learning opportunities, and really engaging with our children and in the world that they live in already. It's really exciting, and we're seeing some really fantastic practice going on with these iPads. We went to big event a couple of weeks ago, which brought all the primary sixes across the borders, every primary six child across the border schools, to this park, and we did a huge digital technology fair, and they had certain stations to go around and really practice their technology skills, and it was wonderful to see how engaged they are and how it's just part of their learning now. As much as a pencil case, they've got their iPad, that's what they learn with, and it's just brilliant. So that's what we are seeing and what we hope to build on. So we have also in our clusters in the borders, we've looked at what platform we can kind of base a lot of our online learning, a lot of our digital learning on, and it's Showbie. So Showbie is a platform that you can, I said, plan, implement, you can assess work, you can give instant feedback, you can use a variety of tools, they can be verbal, they can be written, and the children's work is stored on their Showbie account. So it's also a very good transition tool as well. And it goes from primary 1 all the way up to high school. So we're trying to look at how to join up our approaches to transition, and Showbie is one of the ways we're looking to do that. It can also be used as a tool to report to parents, and either in a bulletin form or in an actual more formal form in parent review meetings and things like that. And it was really compulsory when we were remote, and we used a platform called Seesaw. But now it's looking at it as a really good investment to come away from so much paper heavy resources. It's really working on that, the sustainability, but also that real at a glance. You can look at a child's whole learning journey. That's the hope, is it, that when we get kind of up and running, rolling the second year, but once we get up and running, you'll see an entire learning journey of a child, and it'll be a seamless transition. That's the hope. So that's what we're using in our schools just now, and we're kind of just in talks with other people across the country. Edinburgh are looking to take on the Inspire project. I know, and spoke to a few people at the event in the borders, and we've had people up from Blackpool, and we've had Middlesbrough looking to. So our kind of work is getting out there, and it's very exciting, and I'm very proud to be a part of it. So that's kind of all I had planned for today.
And I want to, point you to this question before you leave us.
Sure.
Because it came from the audience. It's asking, is it compulsory for pupils to use every app the school wants to use? We're researching at Can Digital Me how schools are managing legal basis for this.
So in the terms of, our iPads are extremely well restricted, and they cannot download apps that are not permitted by the authority. They are allowed to take their iPads home, and they are allowed to do work, and that is encouraged, but they are very much restricted and guided by the authority. And so we have a very watchful eye over everybody, and so far haven't run into any issues. But they are the apps, the suite of apps that we were given, it was through discussion with Apple and discussion with teachers as to which would work best. And like I said, it's still ongoing. We're still developing constantly, and we had just recently a bit of a questionnaire to say, has anyone got any other ideas for apps that might work and be useful? And so there's a few fed back. It's licensing, it's more money, so there's never going to be a kind of free for all. But in regards to, I don't know if that was a safety based question, but in regards to that, it's certainly very well managed. They are the children's from, like I said, P4 to S6, but they are council owned and managed by us. So yes. Any last questions? I'm so sorry I can't join you for much longer. What I did here was so interesting. But any final questions before I just dip out and leave you? Or is that me? Okay, well, thank
you. Just a minute.
Lydia, could I ask you a quick question? I'll ask something in a bit more detail. You made reference to the challenges of access to equipment, and I talked to a lot of teachers in different authorities around the Dundee area. They just haven't got the basic access to things like Wi-Fi. You know, the laptops and things don't upload in time. Pupils have problems. During the pandemic, Fife Council, in their wisdom, wouldn't let any bit of equipment work off-site. So there was all these laptops and tablets sitting there that couldn't be used. And the kind of the hardware resourcing issues. How have you found that, and how do you cope with that, and how do you address that strategically?
So for me, one part of my job is really iPad maintenance as well. And it is hard. And our children are a very mixed demographic. So especially in things like the pandemic, we had a school, we were a hub school. So we had children who couldn't access things from home come into school safely and follow the rules and things. But we had that constantly throughout. It is really difficult. And the big push is this equity approach of it should be fair for everybody. So we work really hard with our families. Anyone that's struggling with connectivity at home, we work hard to make sure that things are downloaded within our Wi-Fi, you know, and make sure they can access them from home. But the same rules apply when you're in a school setting of setting homework or having any expectations of your learners. You have to be aware of who's sitting in front of you and whose accessibility might not be as strong as anyone else's. So it's that constant thing of we're still practitioners in the oldest sense of the term. You know, you're not going to send home homework that cannot be achieved by some learners. You have to be, you know, really inclusive. And that's one of the biggest problems is connectivity. So you work around that best you can. And one of the best ways you can do it is through making sure things are uploaded and downloaded in school. So they are going home with those bits of information they need already on their iPads. And sometimes steering away from doing things at home. Everyone's got an iPad. Every staff member has an iPad. They are constantly maintained, and we have a very strong policy about breakages or if an iPad is lost. So we're quite well supported there. We're doing all right in those respects, but obviously things come up that we have to deal with as and when.
Really interesting, fascinating. Thank you so much, Elizabeth.
My pleasure.
Thank you for joining us. And
thank you so much.
Have a lovely day. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Okay. Well, thank you very much to, we don't have any other questions through the chat at the minute, but if I may, there is a question that I had. It's something that Liz mentioned, and I would like to link it back to something that Richard said earlier. Liz mentioned about training teachers, not just to consume, but also create. So I'm just wondering, going back to your observations of those teaching forums, online forums, to what extent has this been a theme in these conversations? Yes, who is this from? I mean, let's just say this is for anyone. Let's just bring the panel discussion kind of forward, because I think we are ahead of schedule anyway. So this is a question for everyone. And thank you, Sardar. I don't think I had a chance to we just say goodbye to Elizabeth. Thank you very much for your presentation. So this is a question of, you know, not just talking about consumption of what's out there, but also creating content, creating resources. To what extent is this conversation happening in these circles, in these professional, grassroots professional development circles on the one hand, and also to what extent are we observing this in policy, in interview data, in survey data? Is this a theme? Volunteers, feel free to jump in.
I'm going to come in from, I guess, not from the like community's perspective, because I don't have a handle of that, if there's any patterns there. But what I can say, I think from the teacher education perspective, yes, that is a critical issue. And I think it needs to start with the professional training that's happening in the teacher education programs. That's something I'm kind of advocating across all IT programs that I'm involved in. And there are already models around, teacher digital literacy. And there is a European Commission model now. It's called digital competencies for educators. And following up from that framework, they recently, I think beginning of this year, they launched the final version of their self-assessment, teacher self-assessment survey called Selfie for Teachers. And that includes the competencies for teachers in terms of their professional learning, in terms of these key competencies, as in, information, finding resources, but also creating their own resources, how they can collaborate with, their colleagues. And so there are 6 areas to that competency framework. And similar to that, I don't know, Richard, you were familiar with that. In 2020, kind of funded and supported by the Scottish Council of Deans of Educators, they supported a framework development called SCDE, kind of digital literacy framework for initial teacher education. And that has also similar components to that. And I think a key to both models is how important the continuous professional learning on this, because we cannot just stop at this has to be addressed in the teacher education programs, initial teacher education programs. And there is not, from my perspective and experience, having taught through the PGD for 2 years now, and it's a very intensive 1-year program, there is not enough room to kind of train upskill teachers at that point. We just have to give them, I think, initial ideas and the framework so that they need to kind of build on that. And I'm going to just maybe turn to Richard, see if he has anything to say on the informal learning, professional learning happening.
Yeah, I'll comment on the IT element, because I work in IT as well in Scotland, and I know in England they're going down this route of it being very school-based, with the new sort of framework for teaching. But they've also gone towards a 2-year program, and we've got a 4-year undergraduate program, so I'll leave that to one side. But I think a longer program, a 2-year with a master's incorporated element, with a far greater link between the universities and the local authorities, is essential, because there's a drop off the cliff with what they get. And I have the same experience. If we try to cram in, when I do the science for primary teachers, I get maybe 4 hours to work at them. I've got 60 of them sat in front of me, and we try to get, and then they go from that hour session to something on values and well-being, and then they go and have a PE session, and we're trying to cram far too much in, and we're not. And I think this adds to that fact that learning, professional learning, is just seen as stuff that's done to you. Then you get pockets like Liz, a fantastic, and she talked about coaching and mentoring. I'm so pleased to hear that, because I think that's where there can be great advantages made. But I think alongside the grassroots professional development and professional learning, this happens in spite of some of this top-down government-led policy. And I would be fascinated to know other people's views on England, Scotland, elsewhere in the UK, whether when policy documents like this are put together, whether the rhetoric matches the reality, because governments don't want to be saying we've put this great initiative in place, but actually very few people have even heard of it. I imagine if you ask Scottish teachers, how many were aware that there had been a new set of standards, professional standards, produced in the last year? I think quite a lot would not be aware of it and would not know how it's changed. And given that that's probably the foremost document they should be paying attention to, when we've got things like digital literacy strategies and stuff like that, and myself and in teacher education, am I up to date with all what's going on? So I think that's one of the challenges and things we have to balance, is this policy rhetoric and how it matches reality. Yeah.
If I could come in there, I mean, I think that's a really good point, Richard. I mean, I think, going back to 2000, when I was working in schools delivering the New Opportunities Fund for Teaching, the NOF programme, this was exactly what you've just said, was exactly what happened. You would go in to give a twilight session on using ICT in the classroom, and they would go, "What's this? Where's this come from?" They had no idea of the policy drive or where it fitted in the bigger picture, or what they were supposed to be doing in relation to that particular policy. It was just delivered in school, you know, and I think it's a really big problem. It's definitely a problem in England that, you know, that there is this policy feeling, a policy narrative of professional development being done, you know, and delivered. You often hear, we've delivered the skills that you need to do this. Well, actually, delivery goes against everything that we know about teaching and learning. So why would you do that to teachers? It's a real challenge, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Something that I was thinking, Alan, did you want to come in? Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say that one of the things I think what will be interesting as we move forward is there seems to be a bit of a tension between the idea that IT and digital learning is good and successful, and on the other hand, the idea that it impacts on behavior management within the classroom, and it you know, you lose control and this kind of thing. So we've got some schools sort of banning phones in classrooms and not allowing laptops because they think kids are just going to go straight onto social media or something like that. I think it's going to be an interesting move as we move forward from this, to properly engage with schools and pupils to say, and someone mentioned about trust in relation to teachers, but I think it's absolutely essential that the trust is extended to the children in the classroom, because we should be embracing, you know, phones should be being used in all the classrooms, in my view. But it seems that there's a tension between, yes, digital learning is good, but there's also it's a problem, you know, there's a behavioral problem perhaps if we allow our kids to have access to technology regularly, you know.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Alan, and thank you, everyone. So there seems to be a lot of disconnect between the narrative and what is actually happening on the ground. And something else that I wanted to pick up on was about the accessibility, which was mentioned by Liz as well. And coming back to those policy documents that you talked about, Serdar, to what extent are things such as, for example, to what extent is there provision for SEND when the government says, for example, we will look to deliver 700,000 devices to pupils? To what extent is there provision for things such as assistive technology, for example? And is this part of the narrative? Or are we, again, we're talking, you know, about equity, but not really on every term?
I think kind of what to points that others did about the narrative not meeting the reality is, we can see that, I think, in there as well. I mean, there is the intent of utilizing digital technology to enhance, and one way to do that, I mean, they argue that it's going to improve access, and it's going to be improve the equity issue for education, but also, I mean, just learning from the pandemic, looking at the peer-reviewed studies of the impact on education. This pandemic actually exacerbated the issue of equity for everyone, everywhere. So access to devices is one thing. Yes, that will improve accessibility, but at the same time, it doesn't necessarily address the more, I think, specialized issues, or the needs for special education students. So I think we will probably see gaps in there as well. So Scottish education is not in isolation in terms of looking at the big picture and the issues. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes, which only goes back to really, unfortunately, reinforce the overall message of, is that are we really responding to that equity gap that we have actually seen being exacerbated over 2.5 years of a pandemic, and we're not really seeing it, are we?
Part of the solution lies, to me, in looking at that integration of digital technology into education, but not seeing technology as an add-on or like the pure solution to accessibility, the inclusion, but the technology, I mean, I'm an educational technologist, and we always argue that the pedagogy comes first. And, you know, the literature back shows that as well, and the research. I mean, without the pedagogy, without the correct integration of technology into the design of your lessons, then technology is not going to help you or solve your problems. So in terms of, you know, addressing special education needs, I mean, we need to then equip the teachers and give them the confidence to think about, as they are integrating designing with technology, what it means for students who are in, you know, who have additional needs, or who are in addition, who are speaking an additional language. So all these things that's to go into the design with the consideration of the technology, not just saying, oh, I've got this, you know, this screen reader, and if I have this there, you know, it's going to solve that. No, you can't just bring in the technology but not think about how that's going to be shaping your curriculum design, lesson design.
Exactly. It's really a reconceptualization, or really being transparent about what we mean by enhancing, which for me, as far as I'm concerned, I don't really understand what enhancing means. I think it's a very vague term and very open to interpretation. I just wanted to gather everyone's thoughts on something that Alan mentioned about, I think one of the findings that came through the first batch of survey responses was this question of who is responsible for online learning at the school level. And I think the most common response that you have received so far seems to be assistant heads. I thought that was interesting, the expectation placed on someone who may or may not have the expertise to lead on this level, kind of at a strategic level of digital planning and implementation. So I just wanted to gather everyone's thoughts and reactions to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to sort of kick off as the issue there is you've got an assistant head who would have been in charge normally of teaching and learning. And then, of course, when all teaching and learning goes online, they're still in charge of that process, but they're not necessarily the best placed person to strategize on online learning. And I think that was a difficulty. It came in so quick, and that's why I think there was such a shift from those people maybe started off, but then I think it became clear that actually someone else within the school would be better placed to engage. And I think that's probably why the movement has occurred between the start of the restrictions and now. But yes, I think it was a big ask for the assistant heads who are in charge of teaching and learning to suddenly move to in charge of online learning, which is something maybe that they weren't particularly good at or.
Yeah, we did see evidence, so didn't we, Alan, of new positions being created. So in a few schools, they were creating new positions of as director of online teaching and learning. And I think that's okay, but I think that there is a danger there that, like with any change management project, you get somebody whose responsibility is very overall and ends up not having a discipline specific focus on what might be the challenges in a particular discipline, because it's not the same, is it, teaching English online as teaching another subject online. And I think whilst there is opportunity there, and I can certainly see the advantage from strategic planning point of view to have somebody made responsible, I do think that in relation to teacher development in the area, it could be rather negative, not least if that person has been the head of ICT and is essentially an ICT champion and may well be talking at a completely different level to a lot of the teachers. So I think there are advantages and disadvantages with that.
I think it was there was also some devolution to the departments to certainly within the survey data to move from it being a sort of whole school to very much kind of department led, because as Jacqueline's saying about the differences in, you know, if you're teaching art or drama or something like that as opposed to another subject. So I think there was a lot more distribution of decision making and creativity we mentioned earlier, I think, so that the departments could actually look at their own unique circumstances moving forward.
In Scotland, this is more of an anecdotal, I think, observation, not backed by, maybe I haven't done research on this, but there is positions now in schools I see as called digital lead in Scotland. I'm not sure if this coincided with the start of the pandemic, but or maybe part of this strategy and change coming down from the government. But certainly those positions, I think, were in more leading position in schools, in primary and secondary schools, and now they are kind of shaping up the strategies for schools in terms of this one-to-one device, implementation and other things. But again, I think this online learning provision is new to many people, even those who were in a position of leading the schools in ICT or digital learning, because as Alan was saying, not very many people were very knowledgeable about the types of online learning or hybrid learning or blended learning. I mean, I can kind of speak to the research that we did at University of Edinburgh in terms of its transition to hybrid learning during the pandemic, and we kind of same issues emerged, and the solution was when we interviewed people who are in an academic leadership position at different levels, including directors of teaching and learning in different schools, and the kind of solution was decentralizing this decision and strategies for hybrid learning. Even we found that the definition of hybrid learning kind of changed from one school, one department to another, because they argue that the subject that they're teaching is different, and it's not same as, let's say, in the College of Veterinary Medicine is different than College of Science and Engineering versus College of Social Sciences. And so I think that those challenges and struggles were not just specific to primary and secondary, but higher education kind of went through the same struggle there.
That's a useful reminder, Serdar. It is indeed, right? Because we do have that sort of somehow that I would say misconception that higher education institutions were very well placed to actually.
Yeah. I mean, I think they were better placed than secondary, yes, because we had the resources. The online education wasn't new to the university, but it was mostly, I think, in more cases, in its own compartment. Like there is an open learning program within the university, but the others don't necessarily do or plan for hybrid blended learning. But now they are doing that due to pandemic.
I have a slight anecdote, if you don't mind me sharing. I hope my colleagues won't mind me. I won't name them. I mentioned that the Education Scotland session about digital literacy being run by people who are experts and it being chaotic. I also joined a session colleagues were teaching just because I saw it. We were streaming everything through an online platform, and I thought, I'm doing a follow-up session to this. Oh, I wouldn't normally be able to do this. I'll join. I joined. The person speaking didn't have the Wi-Fi connection, so kept dropping out. The students were all sat there. She got in touch with somebody to join as backup because they had this in place. But I think that person had another platform open, so their sound wasn't working properly. So I was there and was telling them I was there, but they couldn't see me or hear me to say, do you want me to step in? They were trying to message them. I was trying to email her to tell her. In the end, I just watched this, and this poor colleague just talked to these students for 25 minutes in the hope that they would get something out of it. And although I think that we feel we are better set up, there's a reason we're all here, and this is because we're interested in this. Yeah. Again, with an iceberg metaphor, there's a good 70-80% of people who are not confident and not that interested in it. So we've got to be careful we don't overestimate we don't underestimate some people's abilities, because there'll be people who play it down a lot who are very good, very capable, but also perhaps overestimate what people are able to do. It's something that really does cause people anxiety and concern.
I think as well, it's really important not to take a sort of tabula rasa approach to the, you know, the literature in terms of bringing in commonalities with other sectors, because although obviously a lot of the research in online teaching and learning in higher education is not relevant to the compulsory sector, there's an awful lot of it that is irrelevant. And one of the strands that's relevant is in relation to teacher identity and also leader identity. I mean, one of the things that we saw in the results was the fact that some leaders were feeling that their authority was undermined because they were missing the physical presence of being in school and being seen in school. And it wasn't the same, just being able to lead from an online perspective. So I think there is a lot of literature in higher education on online leadership, remote leadership, and leading remote teams as well, that would also be relevant. And I think, you know, it's important not to take the perspective as some people seem to be taking, that we don't know anything about these things in online learning, because actually we know an awful lot about it. And that includes the way that we define online learning and the language that we use around it as well.
And I have to add here as well, Jacqueline, that I don't think that this language needs to be standardized. I think that it has to remain open and it has to remain adaptable to the local needs of the context, because as Sir Dar said earlier, blended, hybrid, you know, it's very hard to standardize that. Different schools define that, different settings define that differently. And I don't think that's necessary to change. We can speak of high level principles, but we need to be able to adapt implementation locally. Did anybody else want to jump in before I moved us on?
I think that's true, Lydia, but I think that we also need some sort of common understanding as well. And I think there's a danger that too much adaptation, too many local understandings will muddy the picture a bit. Particularly in relation to policy and in relation to strategic development. I think particularly in relation to strategic development of schools, it's very important for them to be clear what they're asking teachers to actually do. And if that is remote learning, or whether that's blended learning, or whether that's online learning, that those terms need to be defined in relation to the particular organisation. Otherwise, there is a danger that people will get the wrong end of the stick. Yeah.
Agreed. Yes. And then, yeah, it's the question of, do you define online learning in terms of delivery, the admin side of it? Do you define it in terms of the pedagogical aims? So there are, I suppose, different aspects to it that we can approach it from, for sure. But yeah, definitely, I agree that there has to be some common understanding. Great. Okay. I can't really see any questions through the Q&A, which means that unless we have anybody else who would like to add any final thoughts, I can move us on to perhaps Jacqueline. Would you be happy to wrap up with some closing remarks?
Yes, that's fine. Thank you, Lydia, for chairing. Well, just to thank everybody for their really insightful presentations. I think the discussion has been really enriching this morning, and I think it's been so enriching because everybody has brought a slightly different perspective in. And I think, if anything, the discussions raised the problem or raised the challenges that are ahead, that even in the terms of a large-scale financial investment, such as the investment that Scotland are making in digital skills, etc., that the cultural change that that needs to be brought about is not to be underestimated, and nor is the power of grassroots development in terms of the people that are actually at the chalk face and carrying out this work. That is not to be underestimated. And I think that we have flagged through these discussions the need for the policy to be informed bottom up as well as top down, because I think there is a danger with every initiative that that won't happen and that policy is just cascaded down. And that will be a shame, because I think that would then risk losing that essential and core element of teacher creativity and how that teacher creativity can develop the next generation in relation to not only digital skills, but their broader sociological implications for society of being digital. So thank you very much. And thank you, Lydia, for your excellent chairing. And can I just also say that this is possibly Lydia's last meeting because she's completing a 3-year term of office. So we'll have a new coordinator next time round. So thank you very much for leading the group for the last 3 years, Lydia, and all the best with your future projects.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline. Thank you. Well, thank you very much to Jacqueline, Richard, Alan, Serdar, and Liz, and of course to Dior and Vera for their excellent support today. And thank you to everybody for their contributions and questions through the chat. It has been a very insightful conversation, and of course one to be continued. By no means are we resolving issues here today, but we are raising questions, or we are approaching issues from a new light. So thank you to everyone. And for me, have a very good rest of the day. Have a very good and healthy summer, and take care, everyone.